Hello, and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest. Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Hendrik Lesser has joined me in the studio today. Welcome, Hendrik.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so am I. For those that watch this show, we know that we start with a question to Hendrik, just to ask him to introduce himself to the audience. So Hendrik, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Hendrik. I'm from Germany. I'm in Munich. I'm a game maker, and I basically are nearly 50 years old. I don't necessarily look like it because I have an interesting background of being a bit German, Indonesian, and Dutch. And so I'm really looking forward to dive into a little bit what that means to me and what that made me as a person and a leader. I think I saw many different things as a game maker. Of course, I'm interested in culture. So I dive in all kind of subject matters. I'm curious about things. And a lot of that kind of made me who I am, I guess. So I'm happy to dive into it more.
Super. Thank you for that. I'm really interested in terms of obviously the industry that you're in. A lot of people be interested in that. I'm interested in your journey. But before we get into the journey, just tell us about when you're not working. We're obviously entrepreneurs, so we work a lot. But when we're not working and we choose to switch off to get that recuperation time, what's the things that you do?
I, as a game maker, play games. I think that's an obvious one. I dive into what I just said, also in different forms of culture. I read a lot of books. I watch TV shows of all sorts, documentaries, fiction, whatever. I'm very curious to see what people are doing all around the world. I have a couple of friends. I have a wife, which I like to spend time with, no kids, so we can do kind of a couple things in a way. But to be very honest, I work a lot, and ultimately, when I have time, I often just what I call sit stupid on the couch. So it not necessarily have a higher purpose to just digest, not to talk, and not have someone trying to talk to me. And so I think I've found many ways to calm down or get into another world, as in the games, to regain some strength and sanity.
Super. Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to getting to know you better. So let's take you back to what shaped you. So obviously everyone that watches the show, there's some nature involved in how we come into this world, but there's an awful lot of nurture in our first system that we encounter, our family. So just take us back to those early days and what was going on for you.
So some of my childhood memories, and which I think shaped me quite a bit, is one is my family setup is, as already mentioned, my mother having this colonial background. There's some trauma involved. Her real dad didn't marry her mom because of Indonesian, Dutch, unfortunately racist reason. My mother found only out when she was 20. We got that told when we were fairly young, which was kind of confusing. Oh, what does it mean? The racism, Germany, our history. So I already had this idea of World War II, Germans have guilt. That was very much ingrained because my dad was a third generation patent attorney coming from an older German honorary family in a way. But him being what I refer to as a cyber hippie. So he was like also more escapist, was very early interested in computers and was a very lefty guy and also religious and so on. So in that kind of melange of different worlds and trauma, to be honest, me being the younger brother of one sister, 4 years older, I early childhoods were already like, I'm listening to those stories, I see them, I hear them, but in a weird way, these moments didn't really necessarily affect them directly emotionally. So I think was also one way to deal with some of those stories. Just give you another example. My grandmother told me stories about the Japanese concentration camps when I didn't eat up, give me crazy horror stories when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, why I should eat because other people died and then went through torture and all this. And I think it deeply affected me, but not in that moment. It's not like that I cried then, right? So it's like I was pushed a bit into this situation of I'm the strong person in the family, the sane person, the rational ones. And I got lots of that input also from my family that that would be kind of my role, right? Because everybody else was a little bit more wild. So in a way, when I now reflect about it as a leader and think about back at those times, I find it interesting that I didn't freak out more, that I, in that moment was like, yeah, it's a story. But now I see why it made me who I am today a lot more. And another thing, which is also interesting, I just got diagnosed 6 months ago with ADHD, right? Which I know that we already discussed back in when I was much younger, but there was a sentiment of, you know, my son wouldn't have that because if you have that, then you are the weird kid in school, and so on. So to a degree, I also knew that my family had some sense of what should be in society, what shouldn't be, reflecting that on me. And, of course, it's a little bit a waste of time to think about what would have become out of me if I would have already taken meds like this, which is, as far as I can understand now, a good medication 30 years ago. But, it's a bit pointless too, because where I am today with those stories, with lots of challenges, which that curiosity, this ever ongoing mind I have and had also made me who I am today. But I kind of felt that I was already not to not say special. It's not like I had a messiah complex right off the bat. As a bit in this, I knew that I was a bit different than the other guys, and that was great, but also weird. Maybe one last story, which always stuck with me. Again, Germany, Indonesian, in kindergarten, in school. Yes, there was this kind of daily racism of all kinds of stuff. The Italians, you make jokes because they eat spaghetti. These kind of childhood racism. And when I said I'm a bit Indonesian, nobody made any jokes because in Germany, kids wouldn't know what Indonesia is. It's so, in the Netherlands, obviously, colonial connection, different thing. In Germany, it's like, no joke, right? So I already understood very early on. I'm not this, German, again, World War II, all that story. But they don't even know how to discriminate against me, which also is somehow weird, right? And not that I'm complaining, obviously, but I realized it back in the days that there were some weird things about it. And what does that make with me and my emotional state, but also how I see identity and who do I want to become? What are my role models and all that? And I think that's ultimately what made me an interesting mix of how I see religion, how I see European identity versus world identity. I'm a guy too, how do I define myself as a male and so on. And ultimately, this is why it resonated to me when we first talked also, but trying to go into the childhood. And it's exciting, it's interesting. Yeah, there's some weird stuff and probably will never stop, right, until I die, to dive into this and certain memories and reflect again and see it even differently again. I think that's a good start to diving into that kind of childhood where I'm coming from.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. And a few things are coming up for me, which I'll share with the audience. You're absolutely right. Many people who experience, the kind of things that you are experiencing in different levels of complexity don't necessarily react in the moment or cry or whether we have these survival mechanisms, don't we, that teach us to survive in those environments. And it's only later when we reflect that we see how they've manifested, which you're going to share with us, I know, in a little while. So I love that you shared that already. But also for later on, I just want you to bank this in terms of your mind, because many clients that I work with and many leaders that I work with have this level of curiosity as you do around what makes me behave in the ways that I do and how can I manage these things differently if I want to. And that's one thing, but there's actually this curiosity about why. And it's really interesting as we delve back into the past. Sometimes we don't need to know the answer why. We can be curious about what's going on now and then how we can change it. So we'll come back to that later because you raised it and I think it'd be useful to get your perspective on that as we go through your career, if that's okay.
Yeah, totally.
Excellent. Good. Thank you for that. So let's really interesting, complex background. So let's move into, I guess, an element of when can you remember was the earliest time, if ever, because not everyone does, that you can remember the first dream that you had about what you wanted to be or what you wanted to do in life?
Oh, that's a very good question. Maybe let me tell you a story, which is not a dream, but an experience again with my grandmother. My second name is Alexander. And my grandmother started very early on to call me Alexander the Great. And this is something I will always remember. And I'm not so sure when that was happening, probably like 4 or 5 years old, very early on. which of course made me wonder, who Alexander the Great is. So I dived in. My dad gave me a book, and told me about it. Blah blah blah. My mom and dad are both interested in history, so they built this idea of grandeur there, right? When you talk about who I wanted to be. So then I do remember that I still do fantasize about military and all this. Maybe it's really rooted into this because obviously Alexander the Great was primarily a general, and I'm not sure if that came before or after. So this idea of a leader, I think, was always there somehow, right? I rarely had any idea of a future self which didn't involve, working with other people, doing something together, not as a king leader, I just command everybody at my will, but as in this, I probably end up doing something with other people. A kid, maybe a bit naive, as in we go conquer the neighbor, as it's all going to be friendly and nice, right? How you see war as a kid very early on, but then obviously what I said before, then diving into the weird things too. So if you talk about the dream of who I wanted to be, I think you mentioned curiosity is kind of a curiosity driven person who works and does stuff together with other people in whatever form. And I think with this, I went through all kinds of dreams, building the pyramids when I looked at it, and all that kind of stuff, envisioning it, fantasizing about it, if that makes sense. But I
No.
can't tell you just one thing, I guess.
No. But you're living the dream now because you've already told us that you're curious and you're working with other people. So that's great.
Yeah.
Lovely. So maybe the way you should do this, Hendrik, I've just thought about this now, but why don't we, because we've got such a great understanding about your background now, why don't we maybe look at the decades? So as you went into the wide world in your 20s, then maybe your 30s and your 40s, which is leading up to obviously where you are now. And just talking about maybe where the leadership style was, how it was serving you, maybe how it got in your way. And as you've matured, how has that developed in terms of your learning about that? That'd be lovely to walk us through.
Yeah. This is you mentioned the 20s, but I do have recollections of becoming a leader already way earlier, right? And this is
Let's go there then. Let's go there.
yeah. So when the early was like kindergarten, I was the gang leader and so on, right? That was all fine. But why do I mention it? Because then I go to primary school and then I witness someone else basically joking about, let's fuck up the Turkish German kid, right? I overheard it. What I did is organize some older friends and we protected that kid, right? And that is a very memorable thing because in that moment I made a decision, I led the guys, and that impacted the next couple of years already. It wasn't really so dramatic, but then, but ultimately, when I then move into kind of a next phase, I started to become a youth leader already as a teenager at the Protestant Church of Germany, right? Helping some organize in schools some of the stuff. But when you want to focus, especially on the 20s, I think I arrived at the phase a little bit confused. As a kid, I had, I think, more clarity of who I wanted to be and who I am and how things work. And then in the teenage times, drinking some drugs or whatsoever. Not that I, think that was a bad time, but it produced more question marks. And then I think it was like 22, 23 years when I really started working. Studied first political science and then philosophy. Aborted both and then started working at a game company already. And I remember there when I think I was leading initiatives, but when I really wanted to get people, then my boss was questioning my capacity to be a leader. So was the first time that I kind of couldn't just do what I think I could do, right? And someone else blocked it. And so of course, I thought about why does he think that? And then I looked at him and what kind of leader he is. And then I also realized I would never like to be him because he's like the Don, right? Everybody needs to be very loyal and then he protects them. And if he says, come to my birthday, which I find already a bit odd, then you have to go and all this. So my early 20s were kind of more defined by who I don't want to be and where it didn't resonate. Then on the other hand, of course, I like to work with people, I like to help them and all this, but my personality is a bit commanding. So especially in the early days, I had this conflict of my personality is direct and fast and, rather active listening. And yes, often too fast coming up with solutions and all this, but this is really deeply ingrained curiosity again in my personality. And that was a big problem to this, what was also propagated to the democratic leadership style. And you should listen to everybody. And I couldn't bring it together well, also with the techniques and all this. And then during that time, in the end of this period at this publishing company of 5 years, big corporate tried to fuck things up. So I formed just workers' council, right? Which of course I became the leader of at mid-20, and then was basically, workers unite and do this. And I had no fucking clue what it means, but I believed in my moral compass. So, then the company needed to pay me with lawyers, so I get fully educated. So what I learned here is like, I want to be educated about things I deal with. And that's totally fine if also other people telling me this. It's not just through my own experience or just me reading books. I'm totally fine to talk to others. But then I also want to basically dive and very much into my guts of this, what I now call kind of an educated moral compass, right? To guide decisions, especially you can imagine with the Workers' Council, it's not just operational decisions. It's much bigger than that. But it also meant, in that company, obviously, the end of my career. It's not like an American listed company thinks it's funny that some mid-20-year-old is forming a workers' council in Germany. So it was clear that I needed to go and leave. So near the end of my 20s, I formed my company in the basement, very bootstrapped. From the money they had to pay me, because I still negotiated well, that if they want the leader of the workers' council to go, they better pay up. And they did. And then again, this kind of, for the first time, setting up my own company. In the early days, I also had a partner, but he wasn't really that interested in the culture of the company. But he was like the sales guy. He gave a little flamboyant vibe to it to a degree. But I was the one thinking about what it means. And I already put the values down on the first website, which is now 20 years ago. So this was already important to me and not just, write in a book, put values on the wall, done, right? No, I deeply thought about it. So I started to relying more and more on this curiosity, knowledge, making up my own mind, but then also decisively acting on it. So I remember some of my colleagues telling me already, small, 3, 4, 5 people, why do you think about that? It doesn't matter. We sit all in the one room. And I'm like, no. This is like, I want to build an empire, right? Alexander the Great again, that framing. And so no, this has to have structure and foundation and thoughts as a foundational basis, which needs to be more than just, let's go make money and figure everything else while we go. So my leadership style, I think one pillar, this education, but the second is the moral compass. And the third, you could argue, is how do I deal with my own triggers and emotions to not just fuck situations up. And there, I have to also be very honest, it's still a journey. And, even the ADHD meds help quite a bit, interesting enough. It's not what I expected. It makes me calmer during the day, so I get less triggered just automatically. So it's still something. And, to be honest, a couple of years ago, when I was 45, I said, now it's halftime, right? Now I'm 48. So there's still quite a while to go. To quote the last business card of my grandfather was, if I feel the urge to work, I lay down until it passes. Because he worked way over his normal pension time, because he never regarded work as a grinding job. He loved what he did. And that maybe is something also which is very key to who I am as a leader in that journey. It's like, I want to love what I do. And why do I phrase it like this? Because I don't every day, but I want to. And I'm glad and lucky that I find it again and again. But this is hard work, techniques, self-manipulation, all that, right? This is, and then I also strongly believe. And, my people now, I tell them, I'm not forcing you to work here. I'm not bribing you with just more money. I invite you to work here. And what the circumstances are, if we live a good life right now or not, is not only based on you and me, right? At the moment, our company struggles, 20 years. The whole world nearly struggles. The games industry had a high time during COVID, and then many reasons. Don't need to get into this, but the whole industry struggles. So yeah, we struggle too. So I sometimes feeling that I'm back to bootstrap days and all this, working 10, 12 hours every day. But again, most of the time I actually really enjoy it, and even more so. And maybe last but not least, if we think about those pillars, is yes, I do have a journey about getting rid of fear. And I don't ever think that I will be fear without fear, but decreasing it and grounding myself in who I am and what I also achieved, right? That helps too, right? I can already say this and this, not so bad. And that helps. And because you also mentioned legacy, right? This is, to a degree, I can tell myself already, I didn't waste my life. right? And that is liberating. And but on the other hand, I still am human, and I still have the occasional this or that, or when I have trouble in my relationship, which is normally fine, but I do have occasionally trouble in my relationship, and not be overcome by it. And I love pop culture, and not have fear be the mind killer, right? Which is a quote from Dune. I think is a very key phrase for me.
I love all the richness you've shared there, and there's so many things coming up to me in terms of how we self-sabotage. And of course, as I was thinking, you were saying sometimes relationships aren't where we want them to be, and then we recognize actually it's down to us of why the relationship is not where it needs to be
Yeah.
in that sense. So I love all of that. So one question I think the audience might be having at the moment, which I'd love you to share with us, is you had those two phases. So you had in your 20s when you were finding leadership roles and you came across someone who wasn't necessarily going to support that, and then you set up the Works Council. What kind of ways were you getting in your own way then compared to in your early 30s once you set the business up? Because they're very different things. You've got obviously a lot more freedom in one. And so just talk to us about that, about how you got in your own way differently in those two scenarios.
So what my thought process were, or how I tackled it, if I get it
Just
correct.
some of the ways that you were getting your way. So how yourself were getting in your own way and how you managed it. So in that sense, both in your 20s and
So, this is in the early days when I was still, not my own boss, right? This is at the company. I, of course, I think as a lot of young people do, I try to then just fix it with me working more, right? Doing more jobs, which in hindsight is also great because it teaches me, multiple hats, doing different things. Why I should be afraid to tackle this or that, right? So it's like at that point, I wasn't so much the leader of other people, but I became the leader of multiple hats, which was basically probably the foundation of what I sometimes now also call myself, as the king of conflicts of interest and many different hats and all this, right? So to start that kind of multi-leveled approach, and then, just working much harder, working every day, 12 hours. Again, I loved it, and really enjoyed it. And it was successful while doing it too. And then in this transition, this disappointment, that the next step wasn't basically happening in that company, then leaving, it's like, how do I get this across to my first people, right? And what I think it means. And this is what I touched before a little bit. In the very early days, I was a bit clueless, right? It would have been way better if my boss would have allowed me to get some people and then, mentor me, blah, blah, blah. So it felt like when I formed my company that it's like, fuck blank slate, right? There's nothing. I have to figure out everything on my own. Ultimately, I had no real commercial experience. Yeah, what I mentioned before with the church or whatever, it's different things, right? Here it's about money, and I think that means other skin in the game. So I think that's a big difference. So yeah, I did read a couple of books about stuff. I asked people to get and inspire me. Again, this idea of having consultants and experts in my life or trusted mentors and all this. And it was a lot of, learning by doing, plus already starting to thinking in system. Again, I'm a gamer guy, right? So I played tons of strategy games and RPGs and systematic games. All of you out there who understand games, it's like, it's not just what you do in this moment. It's right, what's wrapped around it and what's the meaning of that, right? And understanding that system design. So, when I started, I was probably a little bit naive, for sure, because, I put people in these systems. Obviously, people are not bits and bytes, right? So they're not necessarily doing what I think they will do. So in my early days, it was very interesting because, I would hire someone, which I think is a very talented young person, could afford seniors anyway. And then I plan about that person already for the next 10 years, which is a great thought process or kind of, experiment in a way, but it's ultimately completely useless, right? Because, life happens. I really had to learn the first time someone quit, I was really offended, angry, and sad. Not necessarily, and I have to be honest here to myself, because the person was leaving my life because they fucked up my plan. So again, getting rid of fears and the outside world more, to understand, I can invite them, I can build the foundation, the setup. I stay true to who I am because I'm not adapting to every new person. No, it's my company. I can do adapt a little bit, but ultimately we have that value system, and either you take the invitation and then it works, or that person has to leave, right? And to have that clarity without being an asshole or without being some other driven by bad intentions. That took me quite a while, and I think it started in the early 30s, and that I would say I reached a very different maturity state 6-7 years ago. But it's still a journey, right? Don't get me wrong. But where I would really say I overcome certain, elements of conflict within myself and to be able to be more clear, more direct. And that is what I think ultimately is one of the most important things as a leader, either if you lead people or yourself. It's like, what's the idea? Well, what's the trajectory? Where do you want to go? It doesn't need to be one thing. I think, for myself, I know a lot of people have goals and all this, but I don't really believe in that too much. Right? I think it makes it way too easy. I have this one goal and then what then? Then you die, or what's the point, right? I don't get it, right? So it's like rather about images of possibilities of the future, which are interesting to me in my curiosity and my personality. And what do we have to do that to make it more likely to tackle some of them?
So let's now reach out to some people out there who maybe have been in a corporate environment. They may be in their late 20s to mid 30s, and they can see obviously a younger generation coming up. But within them, they've got this churn that says, you know what, I might want to run my own business. I've got a passion, and yet there's something that's holding them back. They maybe haven't got a push factor like you had in that sense. So what advice would you give to them if something's in there and they might be thinking about doing? What advice would you give them before they make that decision?
That they're able to actually make that jump. I think, let me start with the bad news. It's probably never more difficult in the last 20 years than now to start up your own business. The world is difficult, but that's exactly the times you should do it in a way. Because this is where, if you really want to do something, if you see something, if you believe into yourself, then doing it now and seeing that it works and it grows, wherever it is, right? It's not about always super scale or whatever, just making it work, making it healthy is also way more fulfilling, because you know that the element of luck in it is still there. Don't get me wrong, right? Nobody's successful just because they're so genius, right? There's always more than enough luck involved. But if you do it in a scenario now, you know that this is not purely luck. So you can be even more proud of yourself, and you can be even more like testing something out, experiment. Now it's not the time to just do what everybody else does, because 5 years ago that was the buzzword: do this, do that. Everybody's doing it. To me personally, if you want to do this to earn money, fine. But if you're trying to be purpose driven, and when we talk about leadership, I think that's ultimately also what you mean, right? Be in control of who you are and what you do and bring this together. I think it's a great time. And how do you know if you think that you can do it? First of all, you're thinking about it. That already to me kind of proves that you probably are worthy of trying it, because most people just don't, right? They might fantasize while they watch a movie, how cool would it be? But seriously, thinking about it, diving into this, having this urge, probably already means you should do it. Talk to people who are running businesses or groups or are kind of role models in your life, who especially went through difficult times. Because this is also not the time where it's about, you create this one genius plan and then you execute. No, this is the mindset you should have now, have this strong idea, but this willingness to adapt, to stay curious, to also be a little bit like nothing to lose attitude, right? This is, you talked about the certain age. If you have 10 kids, exaggerate, to support, and you're the only one with income, maybe don't, right? Maybe that's reckless, right? Even if it's maybe less self-actualization than in for your life. But if you have the environment and the setup where you can take those risks, what is really there to lose? Look at the stock market the last 2 months, right? How much you could lose, how much you can gain in volatility of the world, or the volatility of the world right now is very high, right? So even if you start a company and you lose it all, is it so much different than keeping with your corporate job and they'll go bankrupt and fire your ass and don't even pay you severance because they fuck you over through some systems and you're just in a subsidiary in this country and whatever, right? There's so many ways how you can be fucked over by the system, that, get free yourself from the system, and just go there with a bit more, I wouldn't say laissez-faire, but maybe stick with this nothing to lose attitude, right? And if what I just said doesn't sound like completely insanity to you at all, again, that's a confirmation that you should probably try it.
Love that. Thank you. And as you're in your 40s now, it'd be useful to build on that particular question and say, if there's somebody now that has been a founder for a while now and is entering into their 40s or mid 40s, what is it you can share that you found most challenging in this decade, your second decade, obviously, as a founder, compared to, again, when you were younger? What are the particular challenges that have been coming up for you?
To be very blunt, I think it's getting easier and easier because my emotional, especially the negative emotional amplitude is less. So that's great. Making games is, of course, I have people who are like 19 years old, right? You know, since I'm 48, right? But the funny part, I don't feel old at all, right? Because I still play the games. I can still nerd on the same level with something most people in society who are much older still think is child stuff, right? I'm still part of that culture. So that's great. What's really more difficult, you know, funny enough, right? Until my medication, my energy level, because just not that I would consider myself old, but I'm not young anymore either. But so far so good. 2/3 of a full dose of the stuff I take in the morning uh, helps me on that level. I think another thing which is I'm not really struggling with, but definitely, of course, is more important sometimes. As in, if I mentioned this thing. Let's say 30 years ago, I would have already taken my meds. Would I now be much more successful or whatever? So these moments of, I wouldn't say doubt, but other possibilities, other alternatives, where this could go. Because I know that certain things I'm probably not going to do anymore in my life because I'm not that young anymore. I'm not going to starting to jump out of planes or something. I could still do it, I get it, but probably not going to be that young in spirit of an YOLO, right? But ultimately, I think it gets more easier. So I'm trying to really hard about challenging, right? I could go into, sometimes, motivating the next guy or whatever, but no, not really. To a degree, my motivation now is more about, again, this invitation. I offer it, I stay calm, I have the coaching discussion, or even more directional or visionary or whatever. And if they follow along, I'm happy. If they don't, okay, tell them 2, 3 times, and then, they're either still part of the company, but, not necessarily rising or growing what I think they could do. Maybe that's a part that I'm a little bit easier to satisfy in my ambition about myself and the people. But is that a bad thing? I don't think so.
Final question for you. That's okay, Hendrik. So I want you to imagine that you can go back in time. Who knows? This might be possible soon. And you're going to go back to maybe that 4 or 5-year-old self who has been told about Alexander the Great. And I want you to make them aware that actually it is you in the future and that everything's okay because you're being successful. What one piece of advice would you give to that 4 or 5-year-old version of yourself that would help them to get through life to where you are now?
If I think about, I want them to have a similar path, it's double down on the curiosity. Never give that up. If, of course, most of the times the questions are a little bit like, what do you give your younger self that you're much bigger and much more successful and more beautiful? I think the healthy answer is not anything, because why would I be wanting to be someone else? Do I really regret anything? Ultimately, no. I think ultimately it's to follow my instincts of self-reflection and believing in myself and not being shy to do this. Even it might be delusional for someone else. That's probably my advice.
Well, Hendrik, it's been lovely to spend time with you today. Thank you for sharing in those moments of vulnerability, the complexity of the place that you've come from, which has made you the person that you are and that curious being.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it too, and I'm really looking forward to, maybe there's some feedback on what people think and where it resonates. It's always interesting to hear, exchange stories, and of course, as I said, a human being, I also want to somehow have feedback loops. So looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So anyone out there that wants to give feedback, Hendrik, I know you're on LinkedIn and they can find you on the website as well. So make sure he gets the feedback so he can build on that as well. Thanks again, Hendrik.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.